Good evening and welcome. My name is Mark Connor, Professor of English and Provost at Washington & Lee, and I am delighted and honored to welcome you to this important event. This event tonight is part of the year-long Education and History Initiative at Washington & Lee. Any institution must constantly and honestly examine its history in the effort to understand who it has been and who it can become. This is particularly true at Washington & Lee, where our long and complex history parallels the history of the nation, replete with its triumphs and its tragedies. This year, we have done a whole series of initiatives, speakers, forums, and gatherings as we grapple with our complex historical past and what it means for our present and for our future. Speakers such as Danielle Allen, Ty Sigely, Blaine Brownell, Charles Dew, Fitz Brundage, and tonight's event are part of that honest grappling with who we are and who we wish to be. Tonight's event is the brainchild of our colleague Ali Colon. Ali came to me in the early winter and said, what about bringing the We Are Charleston project to campus? Would this be compatible with what we're doing in this year-long program? And it took me about -3 seconds to shout, yes, this would be a fantastic idea. This would be a very powerful program. Ali is the Knight Professor of Ethics and Journalism and helps lead the Knight program in media ethics. And I always think of this program as illustrative of what I like to call the W&L difference, where we focus not just on what we teach our students, but why we teach it. What is the moral impact of what our students are learning? And what are they going to do with that content as they enter out into the world? And I would particularly compliment Ali's work in recent years in trying to enhance diversity and inclusion throughout that programming. Mr. Frazier responded to Ali's invitation with saying, our goal is to put the Emanuel story in context and create dialogue about the larger issues which will inspire and motivate students in tangible ways. In describing the We Are Charleston project, they write, in many ways, this church's story is America's story. The oldest AME church in the Deep South, fighting for freedom and civil rights, but also fighting for grace and understanding. And certainly that sounds to me like an apt description of the American challenge and indeed of the human challenge. I'm very grateful to Professor Colon for helping make this possible. Very appreciative to Professor Dayo Abba for moderating our conversation today. I'm now going to turn it over to Professor Abba to introduce our guests and to moderate the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, good. On June 17, 2015, at 9:05 p.m., a young man with a handgun opened fire on a prayer meeting at the Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. He killed 9 members of the church and 5 people survived. Yesterday, just before the end of the school day, a 19-year-old man walked into a high school in Florida and shot several people. There are 17 people dead from the incident and several people wounded. Mass violence seems to have become a persistent thread in the fabric of our society. Our thoughts are with the families and friends of the victims of yesterday's shooting. The case of Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston remains an enigma because after the shooter was captured, 21-year-old Dylan Roof, a white supremacist, was charged with the murders. 2 days after the shooting, while Roof's court hearing was being held on video conference, the families of his 9 victims, one by one, appeared on the screen, forgiving the killer. Herb Frazier has edited and reported for 5 daily newspapers in the South, including his hometown paper, The Post and The Courier. He's a former Michigan Journalism Fellow at the University of Michigan and is currently Marketing and PR Manager at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens near Charleston, South Carolina. Mr. Frazier grew up in the Emanuel AME congregation where his grandmother and father were members of the church. Welcome.
Thank you.
Marjory Wentworth is a poet laureate of South Carolina. Her poems have been nominated for the Pushcart Prize 5 times, and she is the author of the prize-winning children's story, Shackles. Wentworth is the co-founder and former president of the Low Country Initiative for the Literary Arts. She also serves on the editorial board of the University of South Carolina's Palmetto Poetry Series. Bernard Powers is professor of history at the College of Charleston, where he teaches United States and African American history. He has been a consultant to historic sites and has served on the boards of several history-oriented nonprofit organizations. Dr. Powers has been seen in PBS films such as The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, and Slavery and the Making of America. The book, We Are Charleston, not only recounts the events of that terrible day, but also offers a history lesson that reveals a deeper look at the suffering, the triumph, and even the ongoing rage of the people who formed Mother Emanuel AME Church and the wider denominational movement. In many ways, this church's story is America's story. It is our story, similar in some way. The oldest AME church in the Deep South, fighting for freedom and civil rights, but also fighting for grace and understanding, fighting to transcend bigotry, fraud, hatred, racism, poverty, and misery. The shootings of June 2015 opened up a deep wound of racism that still permeates Southern institutions and remains part of American society. Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Marjory has a poem that she recites to kind of center this kind of gathering. So at this moment, I think we'll give you a moment to recite the poetry.
Yeah. Can you? Yep, you can hear me. So the shooting was on a Wednesday evening underneath the church sanctuary, and on Sunday they opened the doors of the church and had services. And the newspaper, the Post and Courier, where Herb wrote for many years, wanted to do a special pull-out section and asked me to write a poem. So I felt it should feel like a prayer, and Reverend Pinckney, who was the minister at the church, had once said, "Only love can conquer hate," and I wrote that down, and it guided me through the poem, which is called Holy City, because Charleston is filled with church steeples. Also, one of the oldest synagogues in America, and a mosque, but it's called the Holy City. Holy City, only love can conquer hate, Reverend Clemente Pinckney. Let us gather and be silent together like stones glittering in sunlight so bright it hurts our eyes, emptied of tears and searching the sky for answers. Let us be strangers together as we gather in circles wherever we meet, to stand hand in hand and sing hymns to the heavens and pray for the fallen and speak their names. Clemente, Cynthia, Tawanza, Ethel, Sharonda, Daniel, Myra, Susie, and DePayne. They are not alone. As bells in the spires call across the wounded Charleston sky, we close our eyes and listen to the same stillness ringing in our hearts, holding on to one another like brothers, like sisters, because we know wherever there is love, there is God.
Thank you. So I would like to start by asking, how does a poet, a professor, and a journalist come together? I know you share the history of all three being from Charleston, but how do you come together to do this book? Would you like to share that with us?
Yeah, well, I'm glad I read the poem because it started with the poem. And a book publicist that had worked with me kept calling me and saying, you should do more. Your heart is in the story. You should write. People are going to be writing about it. It should come from people who live there. And I didn't feel that I was capable of that. This was the hardest thing I'd ever had to write. But I think my husband said, why don't you call Herb Frazier? So I picked up the phone and called Herb, and you can take it from there.
Good evening. How are you all? Well, when I heard from Marjory, I was very happy to hear from her. I had not heard from her in a while. She and I had worked together on some projects in the past, and I'd seen her socially about town. But when she called me and proposed that we do a book on this, it stopped me in my tracks for a couple reasons. First, you can well imagine that the city was very, very much in shock and grieving over this tragedy, and everyone was searching for ways that they could help the community overcome this and contribute in some way. So when she proposed writing, that's what we do, writing. We are writers, so we figured we could write about this. But then there was a surreal moment that overcame me, and this lump started to grow in my throat because I started thinking about my grandmother, who was a member of Emanuel, who used to dress me up on Sunday morning in my little blue blazer, not the same size as the blue blazer that Bernie's wearing now. But I had my blue blazer and my red tie, and I'd go off to Sunday school. But I never got to Sunday school because I'd cut hooky, and we'd go off with my cousins and we'd do other things. But we'd always come back to church by 11 o'clock because that's when service started. And when I was very young, my grandmother would always say that when you go to college, you are going to Allen University, because Allen was an AME Church-supported school in Columbia, South Carolina. I had a sense as a young boy that Emanuel was very important church and very historic church, and I knew of Richard Allen. And I thought for a moment that grandmother and my father, they were up there, heaven, and they had Marjory. They touched Marjory's heart, and they had Marjory to call me. And now, after I got through that moment of emotion, I started thinking about the kind of story that we could do. We could talk about the community. We could certainly talk about those who lost their lives. We could write about the 5 individuals who survived. We could talk about the contributions that Emanuel has made on the Charleston I know. But I knew that I was not well equipped to talk about Emanuel's history and Emanuel's and the AME denomination's contributions to South Carolina and the United States. I'd known Dr. Powers for many years. I'd interviewed him as a journalist, and I was aware of the ongoing research that he had been doing into the AME denomination. And so I told Marjory that if we're going to do this, we need Dr. Powers on this team. So I called Bernie.
So, first of all, good evening, and thank you all for coming tonight. We're so pleased that you're able to make the time for this presentation. And so I've known her for almost 25 years, and really had met Marjory, but really didn't know her. So, in fact, I not only knew her for 25 years, but before I met Herb, I met his dad. That's right. And so we go back a ways, but we had never worked on a project together, not a writing project. So Herb called me, and I was quite surprised and elated to find out about the project. As he mentioned, for a number of years, I've been conducting some research on the history of African Methodism in South Carolina, and I am a member of that denomination, as are most of the members of my family. So I've got some personal interest in the denomination, as well as some a lot of professional energy invested in the study of the denomination. But beyond that, I knew Reverend Pinckney and had been with the pastor of that church 2 months before he was killed. He was a keynote speaker at an outdoors event. This was 2015. And remember, we had been dealing with the Civil War and commemorating and memorializing the Civil War, and we had done that for 4 years. And so Reverend Pinckney was then the keynote speaker at the final culminating event. And he gave his talk, and I was there, and he and I spoke afterwards. And that was the last time that I had the pleasure and the opportunity to speak with him while he was alive. And so we all had those kind of personal connections to the congregation. We spent time there, and virtually everybody in Charleston knows Mother Emanuel, and had just really, and continues to have a dear and special place in our hearts. As Herb mentioned, you know, in this situation, you really feel impotent, because you want to do something, but you realize there's nothing you can really do to change what has happened. But you still grapple with that sense of impotence. And we concluded that yes, we're going to do our best effort, put forth our best effort to try to memorialize the lives that were lost, as well as bring attention to the survivors, and then give people a sense of what the history and heritage of that congregation was really all about. And one of the things that we knew was that most people in the country would have really no idea of what African Methodism as a denomination was, the origins, what its role was, and so on and so forth. And so we needed to contextualize that church and the event. And we knew that there would be different books written on what had happened there. And so we made a conscious choice to write a book that was not a crime story. We were not interested in the crime, the elements of the crime so much, as we were interested in talking about the steps that led up to the crime and why the perpetrator of that act was drawn to this particular place. And we thought it was our responsibility and a role that we could fulfill to explain those things.
Thank you. Well, let's go off of that. Why was he drawn to this place? Could you help us understand the role of Emanuel AME within the Charleston community? A few months before this, there was a shooting in North Charleston, where an African-American male was shot in the back by a police officer. 2015 was also the year where there were a lot of the Ferguson was going on. Yes. So there were a series of these kinds of things going on. So help us understand, why will Dylan Roof pick this particular church as a place to commit this crime at?
Well, I'll start us off at least. Mother Emanuel has a long and storied history as a denomination, as a congregation, which in its past as well as its present was rife with social activism, the promulgation and the implementation of the social gospel, Indeed, this is a congregation in which what I like to call, and other people have called, the gospel of freedom and liberty is woven into its very fabric. And I say that, let me say two things in the way of background. It's an AME church, and so the AME church is established at the end of the 18th century as a rejection of the racism that existed in the white Methodist church. And so it starts up in Philadelphia. And it was also a denomination that, and is and remains a denomination that is designed for people of African descent to be able to control their own religious heritage and destiny and make all of the decisions with regard to their spiritual lives. So Mother Emanuel, or at least the congregation that would develop in Charleston, which was the ancestor to the church that we know now, was an extension of the AME Church, which was an anti-racist, abolitionist denomination designed to provide African people with control over their religious heritage. And that church in Charleston was established in late 1817 or 1818. And you know, this is 40 years before the Civil War, 40 years before emancipation, in the midst of a slaveholding society. And here's the thing that most people don't know. South Carolina is a state that by the eve of the Civil War demonstrated a higher level of slaveholding than any other state in the South. Any other. So Charleston was the heart of this slaveholding place. And so for these people to establish this church, which was never approved by the authorities during the time period, was indeed a revolutionary act. They were harassed, some of them were jailed, fined, but they persisted in this act. And now eventually the church would be closed after it was determined that some of the members and leaders of this early church were involved in organizing a conspiracy to encourage slaves to rise up and take their freedom, the Denmark-Vesey slave conspiracy. Denmark-Vesey was a class leader in this church, and that provided the impetus for the authorities to shut down the denomination. The church, the congregation. And so, you know, this is the early history of that congregation. And there's one thing about Dylann Roof. He studied history. He studied Southern history. He studied African American history. Now, he had a very perverted and disturbed understanding of that history. But nevertheless, we have to always remember that he lived up in the Columbia area, and he drove 2 hours down to Charleston and passed all kinds of black churches, all kinds of AME churches, passed black universities, South Carolina State, Claflin College, passed all those places. So he was on a mission to attack this specific place with these roots, that ancestry, that heritage. And that was a heritage that, once the church was reestablished, continued to motivate the ministers and the members of the congregation there. And, you know, Herb and Marjory may want to talk about some of the more recent history there, but those are the roots of that congregation, deeply woven into social activism, social justice, anti-racism, the absolute antithesis to the white supremacy that Dylann Roof believed wholeheartedly.
Yeah, and it was very plain. I mean, he planned for months, and every time he'd go to Charleston to go to a plantation or some historic site, he would always circle that church. And he also wanted to go to Bible study because he, quote, wanted to kill the best people he could find. He wanted to do that. That was part of his mission. We found out later that he had some second and third and fourth choices. One of them was his
Yeah,
church.
that's right.
There were other places he thought of launching this attack, but he was afraid he might kill some white people. So, you know, he was, once he set his sights on that.
It seemed like he was very selective about where
Yes.
he wanted to commit this
Yes,
crime.
yes, absolutely, absolutely.
One question that I had when I was reading some of this is that one of his goals was to start like a race war, and I kind of wonder if Herb can help me understand that. Is, you know, the history of this church will, of course, maybe committing this crime in Charleston, you know, but there was no race war. We'll get to that in a second, but can you help explain a little bit on doing this act and hoping for a race war in this
Charleston
process?
Charleston, no doubt, is a very unique place, its culture. Being the cradle of slavery, white and black people have lived closely together for generations. There is probably not a black family nor a white family in Charleston that will not tell you about the domestic workers who either cooked for, raised, and cleaned the homes of white people, or the whites who have a beloved
Like
nanny
Nanny, yeah.
who raised them, who they were closer to the black woman in the house than their own mother in many, many cases. So I think, first of all, Charleston is close in that regard. But then again, there is, unfortunately, a very paternalistic kind of relationship between the black community and the white community in Charleston. And Charleston had been always somewhat integrated as a community where you had whites and blacks living on the peninsula of Charleston, black businesses going back into the 19th century along what is now an all-white gentrified Broad Street. There were black businesses on Broad Street. So Charleston has always been close. Now, fast forwarding to the 20th century, at the time of this tragedy, there were a lot of things that were going on that night that we knew of and we later discovered. First of all, a lot of the black ministers that night came together and were pushing out, physically pushing out and standing as a barrier to keep out people who wanted to come into Charleston to do evil things. Trying to think of a better way to say it, but to do evil things. And we saw some of that night. We also later learned that the police department, they had intelligence and they had people placed to block some of that infiltration from the outside. Someone mentioned the other day there are a lot of black landowners in downtown Charleston, and they were trying to also bring a lay peace. So nothing would happen like we saw happen in Ferguson and Baltimore. But I think a very important element that was already in place before this tragedy, and when we speak around the country, we encourage people to put in place an organization that we have in Charleston called the Charleston Area Justice Ministries, which is called CAJM. CAJM had been meeting for a couple of years before this to address some social justice issues in Charleston, things like truancy, high expulsion rates in the school, police violence, unwarranted stops by the police, and other things. So there was already a relationship in place by some of the leading churches in the community. So when this tragedy struck, it was almost automatic. They could pick up the phone, they picked up the phone, they got the city behind, the city government behind efforts to hold peaceful rallies, prayer vigils, and meetings to sort of kind of lay a calm about the city. And of course, you have to remember, this shooting in Charleston was unlike Baltimore or Ferguson. It was not a police shooting, or the one in North Charleston. This was not a police officer who killed 9 lives. So that was not the element. And the quick arrest of the shooter the next day also helped to bring, because believe me, I think everybody was on edge in Charleston. But with that arrest, there was this, everyone exhaled. And then you could go about the business of how are we going to overcome this? How are we going to heal, and help the families affected by this?
I think also the forgiveness offered by the families on the Friday after really set this tone. It just, whatever tendencies at that point toward violence were out there, and they were certainly out there. In the face of that, it just kind of cut right through it. I mean, how can you go out and have a violent protest when these family members have forgiven the killer? Now, we explain in the book that that's an oversimplification. Many of the family members did not, and it doesn't sort of whitewash what happened. But if you look at all those things in a row, by the weekend, by the church service, that kind of calm just stayed there. You know.
Let's talk a little bit about the forgiveness. I'm interested in that. The philosopher Ernest Renan said that nations must forget the past in order to forgive and move forward. Did the families and friends of the Charleston 9 offer forgiveness to Dylan Roof as an attempt to forget the unforgettable?
Forget their own.
Forget the
Unforgettable.
The unforgettable. The unforgettable. I don't think that they offered it for that purpose, because this is going to be something that, regardless of what they do, it's going to be with them forever. But what we know from having spoken to a number of the family members is that they already understood, and the event threw what they understood into a bolder relief. And what they understood was that unless they offered forgiveness as a way of purging themselves, freeing themselves, liberating themselves from that which comes so naturally to those that have wronged you, hatred. They already understood, because of the way so many of them had been raised, the lessons that they had been taught at Mother Emanuel and other places, that they didn't want their lives to now become perverted, distorted, corroded by this event. And so a number of them saw it as an act of liberation and breaking what was the potential hold that Dylan Roof could have had over them, the living, for the rest of their lives. And they understood that. And in the course of doing the research for the book, we came to have a greater appreciation for Bishop Desmond Tutu, who writes about forgiveness and the nature of forgiveness. And until I really read his writings on this subject, I had no idea of how many people, how many scholars and philosophers are presently, along with him, engaged in studying this phenomenon. But it's huge. It's huge. So that's one aspect.
Yeah.
That's
And
one aspect.
when we first spoke to them and read interviews, many of them, and some of them were not at the hearing. For example, Chris Singleton said publicly, that's what my mother would want. And I think it came from that, too, that they wanted to honor that piece of the departed. But, one of the women who forgave was in the room. saw her son killed in front of her and her aunt, and protected her grandchild. And she said, he doesn't care if I forgive him, I did it for me, which goes to what he's saying. And I think that was, it was in their hearts to do that, but like he said, it was something that was already the way, through their faith, that is the way they looked, that was already their framework, I think is the way I'd say it.
Well, also that framework, the three of us interviewed Joseph Darby, who's a leading, presiding elder in the AME Church. And he said, as a Christian, forgiveness should be hardwired into you. I mean, that should come naturally. And I think that, in Charleston, Marjory did much of the research in the area of forgiveness, and of course you can speak to this, that in a slave society, that forgiveness was a kind of a survival mechanism for the enslaved. It's not meant that you're going to forget or, but imagine that if you held all that hatred in, it could be self-destructive. It could consume you. So I think in Charleston, and we did not do definitive research on this, but we did quite a bit of reading, that this is something through religious, what's the term that Cone used?
Oh yeah, James Cone.
James Cone, liberation theology,
Black
liberation theology, that forgiveness is a fundamental element of that.
He happened to come to Charleston while we were writing the book, which was a blessing.
So, what I'm hearing is that the forgiveness is more for the forgiver and not for the offender, so to say, especially in this situation where forgiveness was unsolicited.
Right.
He did not ask for forgiveness. As a matter of fact, he had no regrets based on what I read about what he has done. So forgiveness in this sense is, I guess, a form of restoration and a way to find peace maybe. Well, I was, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a German priest. And he was in the concentration camp. And he spoke of forgiveness among Christians. He used the word cheap grace. By this, he meant the justification of sin without the justification of the sinner. So, I kind of evaluated, because everybody was shocked how quickly the forgiveness came. And as a matter of fact, some of the family members were not so forgiving, including one of them that was a pastor herself. And I raised this question because we as a community, we are dealing with challenges of our own as an academic institution, and also in the larger sense, as a community in Lexington, Rockbridge County, and in Virginia. Some of the challenges of the burden of our history, how do we think about the past and move forward, and what role forgiveness might play in that. So I was just kind of curious about some of the lessons that you learned about forgiveness that you might be able to share with us as we struggle with some of the challenges that we face that is in some ways similar to the situation in Charleston. Not necessarily the tragedy, but with the
same
situation.
issues, same underlying issues. Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I mean, I think he just mentioned Bishop Tutu, and we think about one of the most famous examples of forgiveness and truth and reconciliation took place in South Africa. There is a movement to have national truth and reconciliation over slavery and treatment of Native Americans, etc. But we haven't done it yet. And I think it's something that seems to be it's beginning to happen in various communities. Certainly something that we talk about in South Carolina quite a bit. We just had the 50th anniversary of the Orangeburg Massacre, which three African American college students were killed and many others were shot. And there's never been any kind of justice about what happened there. And there's a call for truth and reconciliation in that way. So, but in the process of that sort of process, forgiveness is a piece of it. And if possible, I mean, that is part of that process. But where do you see that sort of process happening in this country? Is it happening in Virginia? Is it happening in Charlottesville? I mean, there's pockets of it, but it has to happen everywhere. And it's going to take a long time, but that's how it's changed. And certainly it's how you look at history, in terms of how you look at these issues. But I think you have to have people sitting down in a room together and having these conversations.
We also have the conversation. I'm sure when Marjory said Orangeburg Massacre, most people, Orangeburg what? You all know Kent State.
You all know Kent State.
But you don't know about what happened in 1968 on the campus of South Carolina State College, which is in Orangeburg, South Carolina, near the Capitol. I think in order to bring all of these things to the forefront, we need not only a continuing dialogue, but we need a truthful telling of history, I think, to really get to some of these narratives that have been put under the table because they're very uncomfortable situations. Mm-hmm. I find myself in a very uncomfortable situation sometimes because, as you introduced me, I do the public relations and PR for Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. It used to be a rice plantation up until 1840, and up until 1865, the folks who worked there were enslaved people. Now, you can look at me and see that my ancestors didn't come here through Ellis Island. They came here through transatlantic slavery. So how do I end up in this situation? Trying to sell a former Southern plantation, which is now a garden. Well, I enjoy my role there because of what I just said, because we get to put that narrative on the table every day and doing special events to tell that story so students, young people, can understand the history of at least South Carolina and Charleston and how all of that, and in the book we talk about slavery, the sin of slavery. We talk about that slavery was not confined to the southern colonies, that there was slaveholders in Philadelphia, in New York, and in your hometown in Massachusetts, in Boston. So it was across the colonial America. So I think you have to get to telling all sides of the history. Yeah.
And that gets to my last and final question before I open it up to the public, which is some of the challenges that have been brought up. You brought up Desmond Bishop Tutu, and in South Africa, some of the counter narrative has been, how do you have reconciliation, forgiveness and reconciliation without justice? And, and that gets to, what form or shape justice takes. We don't know, but is that can you truly have forgiveness and reconciliation without justice? And I'm getting signal that I need to kind of wind this up, so you don't get to answer that from me, but maybe somebody else will raise it. So I'll open this up to the public and give them a chance to answer questions. Oh, it's about can you have forgiveness?
Justice.
Okay. Do you want me to repeat the question when they ask it? Absolutely. So, all right, CJ.
I mean, I would happily repeat part of that question the South African historian. So I thank you so much, all of you, for coming, and I think that this is a phenomenal and extraordinarily important series of conversations to be had, and I want to return both in sort of the idea of truth and reconciliation and also forgiveness in sort of a structure of a vastly unequal society.
right? And this sort of idea in which how might not only this sort of specter of reconciliation and also the action of forgiveness might also still perpetuate for people who have sort of structural advantages and also an investment in not actually seeing their own complicity or investment in cycles of violence. How might these sort of actions then performatively alleviate people from a sense of complicity or even an investment in transformation? This has been some of the sustained criticism in the last 20 years since Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa has been this has allowed the predominant segment of the population, the minority white population in South Africa, to feel like the work has been done and it was never done for them and they're fine. And thinking about this relationship to Charleston, but also for us here in Virginia, right? This sort of way in which how my performative actions of both forgiveness and reconciliation also might limit a hard and necessary conversation about historic complicity in terms of racial division and also about contemporary sort of constructions of whiteness. I think also in a moment of a rise of white supremacy, how do we get people to actually recognize that and does that fit in or where does that fit in?
Yeah.
And I'm not going to repeat TJ's question because I think you will.
Can I just say something here? So real quick, we write about that in the book because it is a real problem in Charleston. You know, in terms of the race-based social justice issues, whether it's the schools or housing is a huge issue now, wages. I mean, we still have, like our public high school in the city of Charleston, there's only one and it is 99% African American. And, you know, without action and without having, you know, you just look at that one thing, schools, okay? So you want to get people together in Charleston to make change, you have to have skin in the game. You have to have money on the table that creates change in these schools. I mean, that's just one thing. And this organization, Charleston Area Justice Ministry, is constantly putting pressure on the leadership to make changes. But I think it's the same problem everywhere we go. Every community has the same issues. And you know, getting people together without without actionable items and the leadership, whether it's city, state, whatever, but the leadership in the room, it's just talk. And in Charleston, I can tell you, we're a little sick of that. All right, you have to have, after this horrible situation, we had to have vigils and we had to have, but you know, every town hall that we went to, I mean, the anger over things that had nothing to do with the shooting, okay, was palpable. And you know, and what changes are being made in that way. And that's really where we're at. So,
You know, related to your question is something that I've experienced over the years. And in fact, I just had an example of this occur in the past week. But you know, it really is about, and this is not a cliche, but I think this is ultimately the only thing that we have. It is about educating people. It is. Unfortunately, that has proven to be a slow process. But what I'm getting at is this. You know, just as you've said, whites conclude, well, I wasn't around back then. I wasn't around. I didn't do anything. I didn't benefit. And so it is the job of some of us who are in these positions to educate people to demonstrate this linkage between the past and the present. And that's crucially important. Here's another aspect of this. You know, people are so quick to conclude and to take the easy way out and say, well, the civil rights movement benefited black people. They're the only ones that benefited from that, you know. And you know, when I teach civil rights, I always make it a point to talk about the '64 Act and how religious minorities benefited from that, women benefited from that, and if women benefit from that, white women benefit from that, then white men who marry them benefit from that. And we've got to tell the stories this way so that people get those messages, because white Americans are so quick to dismiss any benefits that they've gotten from the racism of the past, as well as movements like the civil rights movement in the recent past. And the fact that in so many ways the movement of the 60s improved the nation at large is something that we really have to stress over and over again. And unless you do it in that way, people will never get it, because they want to take the easy answer. Oh yeah, this is about what black people got. This is what black people got. Well, and one of my students was telling me this just this past week. Oh, right. So yeah.
Well, in the PowerPoint, and I'll make this very short because we get to another question, but in the PowerPoint that we normally do, the concluding slide is a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I'm paraphrasing, I hope I don't get it too wrong, but I think he said, if we don't live together as brothers, we're going to perish together as fools. And that really sums it up.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
Other question?
Oh, yeah.
So, first I wanted to say something just occurred to me on this important business of truth and reconciliation and forgiveness and all that. Something else is also part of sort of the Christian experience is confession. But it's that's a deep thing. It is real, and it's done very quietly and privately with a lot of tears. When it's public, then it becomes public trial. And certainly Dylan Roof hasn't been looking for that, but it's still something we need to think about as part of that dynamic. It's a deep transformational thing. But actually, what I want to ask about is a journalist question, because we talk about the antebellum period, but the period that some of us older people grew up in.
I'm not that old.
In the 60s, it wasn't the Post and Courier, it was the News and Courier.
Yes.
And the News and Courier was one of the bastions of resistance to segregation.
Oh, yeah.
And an editor named Tom Waring.
Yes.
Yeah.
We would get, the racists in Atlanta, where I grew up, were subscribing to the News and Courier, because that's where the message came.
Yes.
And there's a book now called Newspaper Wars that Sid Bedingfield wrote.
Yes.
South Carolina's incredible power of the pro-segregation resistance that came out of the newspapers in South Carolina. And to me, that's living history.
Well, I lived that history.
Right, I know.
And I was 21 years old when I walked into the newsroom of the News and Courier in April 1972. And when I got the job, my father looked at me strangely and he said, "Why do you want to work for those people?" He wanted in 1955 burn the newspaper down because of its editorial support on segregation. So, Daddy began to understand not only what I did, because he says, "You do what? They pay you to do what? To write?" "Yeah." "Write what?" He would say. But after a while, the newspaper business, and by the 70s, was transitioning into a situation where they were trying to, the best they could, embrace the idea of diversity. Because I was the third black person to work in that newsroom. And so the News and Courier, which is now the Post and Courier today, owned by the same company, same family, the Manigault family, its editorial position has gotten a little bit closer to the center. Its news content is very progressive. The newspaper 3 years ago won a Pulitzer for its coverage of domestic violence in South Carolina, because at the time South Carolina led the nation in domestic violence. We lead the nation in something, So you're right. The whole newspaper industry, if you go back to the LA riots and the Kerner Commission report, never really covered communities of color fully. And that problem persists today because of the economic pressures which have reduced the size of newsrooms in the United States. And to some degree has made it, I mean, people are fighting for fewer and fewer jobs. So it's much more competitive, so you see fewer and fewer people of color in the newsrooms. And it's an ongoing problem. And how you get around it, I think it's going to take some time and some persistence.
Thank you. Other questions? I want to take one from a student.
So I'm from Charleston, and so since the shooting took place over the summer, I definitely noticed that it was my junior year in high school, and we not once talked about it once we got back to school, and which was it was really weird, and so I feel like I was just a very missed thing to talk about, especially, and I went to academic magnet, which is not diverse. And so I was just wondering if there's still how we can go to especially the Charleston schools to educate them on
Yeah, I just did a 5-day residency at Simmons Pinckney, which is the middle school near the public high school, named for Reverend Pinckney, as part of that effort. But I was sort of brought in as an extra, I think it was right on the heels of the Southern Poverty Law Center's report about lack of information in our textbooks and school systems about the history of slavery. I don't know how many of you saw that South Carolina came up particularly short on this. So it's still a huge problem. And, we would love to, we've been in high schools in other places, haven't we? We would love to talk about it. And, but I do think it's a missed opportunity. There are some efforts with some of the, the Illumination Project and some of that, but nothing across the curriculum. And, it really needs to be done. And it might be something that we're getting an International African American Museum. And, I'd like to think that part of that social justice programming will be doing some education, doing some, that kind of communication out, work in the community. I don't know, but it's a possibility. It's going to take something tangible like that to permeate the schools. That's really so sad.
It is, because that's the top high school. That's
one of the best high schools in the country, by the way.
But in the country.
But to think that it wasn't
that that they're not dealing with these issues because they're afraid. The principals, the teachers are afraid to deal with these issues. Now, it's also the role of parents to be involved in the PTAs and make sure, and on other committees that are in communication with the school board, they have a role to play also to make sure that these issues are properly addressed. Because for one thing, just think about this. These students, it's not as though they didn't know what happened. They knew what happened, and they were traumatized by what happened. And so to think you could sweep this under the rug is just foolish. It's just foolish. But those are the kind of games that are played every day. And in fact, just in the past 2 weeks, it was revealed that in the new social studies standards for the state of South Carolina, they have not included a single major civil rights figure.
Oh, that's what it was.
The recent standards that are in the process of being approved right now. So it is a travesty what these people are doing, and will not be made better, will be made worse. And I appreciate you saying what you said. Thank you so very much.
And that's a lingering legacy, because when I was in elementary school, at the elementary school right across the street from Emanuel, and you know where it is, it's now called Buse Academy. Well, it was Buse Elementary School, and there were no white kids at Buse back in the day. And back in the day, we got our South Carolina history written by Oliphant. forgot her first name, but Oliphant's History of South Carolina, and in it talked about the happy slaves and how everything was fine and everybody got along. So what Dr. Powers is talking about, that distorted view of history in the public schools in Charleston, went back when I was a kid and even before, perhaps. Yeah.
There is this great curriculum, Teaching Tolerance, available on the Southern Poverty Law Center website. But, you know, who knows how many people are using any of the resources on that, you know, in that curriculum. I don't know. Obviously, not enough.
Right,
Oh, yeah, you got the
right
magazine.
there.
Yeah, yeah,
Right there.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, good.
Oh, it's an amazing resource, right?
Good. Yeah. That's good.
You had a question.
I do have a question, and I'm hearing about local, state, national, even some international angles on that. Very compelled by the community aspect of your project. Was haunted by your remark about how Ruth came to Charleston and passed all these places and didn't do that. Thinking about Charlottesville, which is dependent in some ways on that being a narrative about outsiders coming into us. And you know, that's a slippery thing, but I wonder if you could reflect on a sense of insider-outsider, that there are different circumstances there, but it goes to, I think, some of these ideas about truth, reconciliation, implicity that they brought up. You know, if you can say, well, it's them and we acknowledge it, but it's not really who we are in Charlotte.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
Who do we need to be is not quite.
Our mayor at the time, that was one of the first things he said. Oh, he wasn't from here. Well, he was homegrown South Carolinian. I mean, he was
That's right.
very, much from the place just because he wasn't from the city. And I think it's a national issue. I mean, I think that just because this particular story has its roots in this particular church, he had no original ideas. Okay, Dylan Roof had no original ideas. I mean, everything came from this distorted view of American history, white supremacy sort of conflated, with this sort of a lot of ideas that Hitler had. But like he would watch a film like Birth of a Nation and think it was true, So all those ideas are still out there, and I think they're more available and more prevalent than ever in terms of the white supremacist websites that he looked at, that said, for example, talked about black on white crime. I mean, I don't know if you know this, but what inspired this young man was the murder of Trayvon Martin, and he said to himself, well, what's the big deal? That's what he said, an unarmed black teenager, Then he looked on the internet and found he was fueled by all this ideology of, black on white crime, and he believed it hook, line, and sinker. So I think it's a problem in every community in America at some level. And even if it's not race-based, maybe it has to do with religion. Maybe it's a gender issue. I mean, all of these issues, if you're the one being discriminated against in any circumstance, it doesn't matter. You're feeling that pain, right? And I think these ideas are more pervasive than ever.
All right. Well, you've given us a lot to think about, and thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. Please join me in giving a WNL thank you.
Thank you.